All right, thank you again for joining today's webinar, An Introduction to the DHS Nonprofit Security Grant Program. We are grateful to have you all here, along with our expert presenters. You'll see listed here, and we'll run through as we go through the program, as well as our great partners from across the American Jewish community and the broader faith-based community. A few logistics before we get into today's program. This is a webinar, meaning all attendee videos and microphones are off and will remain off throughout the program. The Q&A, however, is open. Please submit any questions to the Q&A function, and we will address as many as possible in the time allotted. We work to answer the hundreds of questions we receive through the Q&A during these sessions and make those available on SCN's Nsgp webpage following each webinar. Additionally, this conversation is being recorded and will also be made available after today's webinar, as well as posted to the SCN webpage. With that, I will turn this over to SCN National Director and CEO Michael Masters for opening remarks.
Thank you, Dina. On behalf of the Secure Community Network, as the official safety and security organization of the Jewish community in North America, I'm honored to welcome you all to this webinar. I'm particularly honored to do so as this webinar represents the first time we have come together as a faith community to work together on ensuring that our whole community is positioned to take advantage of the Nonprofit Security Grant Program. Our work together is especially critical right now. According to the FBI, our great partners, hate crime incidents in churches, synagogues, mosques, and temples increased by roughly 35% between 2014 and 2018. According to the FBI, 2019 saw the highest number of hate crimes since 2008. In September 2019, the Department of Homeland Security warned that the faith-based community were threatened by domestic terrorists. 1 year later, and while facing unprecedented challenges in our communities and organizations from COVID-19, the threat remains. In coordination with federal law enforcement and DHS, SCN assesses that far from current conditions decreasing the likelihood of an incident, particularly in our faith-based community, stressors from the pandemic may increase them. This means that as we open our facilities and communities, we must be more committed to safety and security. Moreover, in many cases, our institutions, regardless of faith, face a common adversary, motivated by hate, armed with powerful weapons, and committed to violence. By working together, though, we can stay safe together, and we must. From mosques and churches to gurdwaras, synagogues and temples, and the many other types of institutions supported by the faith-based community, from schools and camps to senior centers and campus organizations, we need to ensure that these vital parts of our society of who we are protected, that people feel safe and secure in walking into our institutions. SCN is honored to co-host this webinar with our fantastic partners, the Jewish Federations of North America, as well as the broader community, the U.S. Council of Muslim Organizations and the National Council of Churches. I'd like to thank them for their partnership and also welcome the dozens of other faith-based organizations who are with us and participating today. One of our greatest strengths as a country and as a faith-based community is our diversity in practice, custom, and tradition. When it comes to security, though, we must take a comprehensive, consistent, coordinated approach. Coordination is not just a condition of success when it comes to security, it's a requirement for it. And by working together, we're not only making ourselves safer, we're making a statement. We will not be stopped as a faith-based community by hate or violence. We will stand together. No one in this country should ever question whether it's safe to walk into a religious institution, and an attack on any of our institutions, regardless of size, location, or affiliation, is an attack on all of us. And while we're making progress, we have more work to do, and we have opportunities to take advantage of. And one of those key opportunities is the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, or the NSGP. NSGP funding is now protecting more communities in more places. Recent changes allow organizations in non-urban areas to take advantage of this program. From attacks in Overland Park, Kansas and Sutherland Springs to Muncie, New York and White Settlement, Texas. As the threat has changed, this has been an important expansion. NSGP funds provide training that saves lives today. NSGP funds can now be used to support planning, exercising, and training for everyday citizens. For organizations that could not support such training prior, this can literally be the difference between life and death. It's our goal that every faith-based organization is informed, positioned, and able to apply for and use these funds in an efficient and effective manner. Please note that we anticipate that the grant will be announced in mid to late February. Historically, it'll close 6 to 8 weeks later, but that doesn't mean you should only take 6 weeks to complete the application. Please take advantage of the opportunity and the time to get to work now if you haven't started already. NSGP funding has made our community more safe and secure. It's placed electronic locks on exterior doors of community centers, panic buttons in school classrooms, and provided training in our houses of worship. But it can only do this if we take advantage of the opportunity. We're grateful to the Department of Homeland Security and our appropriators in Congress who have worked hard to make the opportunity available. Let us work together to make sure we're not an easy target, but a prepared and vigilant community and country. It's now my pleasure to introduce a friend and colleague, Rabbi Isaiah Brothstein.
Thank you, Michael. And amen to that. May we stand together. So shalom, friends. Good afternoon. On behalf of JFNA, Jewish Federations of North America, and our public affairs team, thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Navigating the Nonprofit Security Grant Program and Application. My name is Isaiah Rothstein, and I serve as a rabbinic scholar and public affairs advisor at JFNA. And I just want to say a special thank you to our team who brought us together for your dedication and your wisdom and your leadership, and also for building frameworks that help ensure our communities are safe and secure, equitable, and just. Friends, participants here with us today are zooming in from around the country, representing the diversity of our multiracial, multi-ethnic, and multi-faith democracy. Our hope is we can continue to strengthen our partnerships in building a safe and secure America for all. Friends, more than 19 years ago, in the aftermath of 9/11, JFNA urged Congress that and I quote, further deliberates on issues surrounding homeland defense, and in particular focuses on how best to secure local communities, it should include considerations of the security needs of the nonprofit sector, end quote. We knew at that moment, which has unfortunately been borne out into many instances over the years, that whether church or mosque or synagogue, community center or school or other faith or affiliated organizations, the shared risks to our communities from racially and ethnically motivated extremist violence has been persistent and growing. And so again, to what Michael just shared with us a moment ago, let us stand together. Since then, friends, JFNA has worked with Congress, leading in multi-faith effort in establishing the Nonprofit Security Grant Program in 2005 and appropriating nearly $600 million since the program's inception, including $180 million this year. And let us just be reminded of that impact as we join together, as we come together to consider the needs of our many communities. So this program supports physical security enhancements and activities and other nonprofit organizations that are at high risk of terrorist attacks and violent homegrown extremism. This nonprofit security grant program is for all of us. It's for all of our houses of worship, for all of our communities, so that we can all thrive and feel a sense of security, of dignity for our parents, for our children, for all of our loved ones. So today's webinar, as was already shared, is jointly hosted by the Jewish Federations of North America and the Secure Community Network. It is also co-sponsored by our friends from the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations and the U.S. Council of Muslim Organizations and the National Council of Churches, and all of you. And so with that, I'm happy to turn your attention to my colleagues who will walk you through the nuances of the grant. And I'm grateful again to be here with you. I'll pass it back to you, Dina. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Prior to getting into the details of the NSGP for this faith-based community, everyone gathered here today, we're going to hear some brief remarks from a great friend and advocate of the program. Earlier this month, the Jewish Federations of North America convened its Washington mission, which offered the opportunity for policymakers to speak to and hear directly from the Jewish community on issues of mutual concern, to include the Nonprofit Security Grant Program. As part of that, Representative Benny Thompson of Mississippi, chair of the House Homeland Security Committee, spoke to the importance of the NSGP and its value for each of our communities and our collective safety and security. We will hear those brief remarks from him now.
It's a privilege to be with you today to discuss this very important topic, the rise in domestic terrorism motivated by anti-Semitism and other hateful rhetoric. Organizations throughout this country at grave risk. I recognize that nonprofit organizations that may be targeted often do not have the resources needed to make and keep their facilities safe. That's why I'm such a strong advocate of the Nonprofit Security Grant Program. For many years, this Department of Homeland Security Grant Program was funded on an ad hoc basis through annual appropriations and only reached at-risk nonprofits in high risk urban areas. Then in 2020, in partnership with the Jewish Federation and other stakeholders, we were able to broaden the reach of this critical program and bring a measure of stability to the program for years to come. A couple of weeks ago, we celebrated the first anniversary of enactment of the Securing American Nonprofit Organizations Against Terrorism Act of 2019. I worked across the aisle with Senator Portman to get this law enacted, and I can safely say that when it comes to Nonprofit Security Grant Program, support is bipartisan.
I would now like to introduce our experts for today's conversation. Patrick Daly, Principal Deputy Director and COO for SCN, the Secure Community Network, and Rob Goldberg, Senior Director for Legislative Affairs at JFNA, to go into the details on this year's NSGP.
Can you pull up the slide deck, please? Thanks, Dina. Welcome, and on behalf of our friends at JFNA and SCN, pleasure to be here with all of you today. As Michael and Dina had mentioned, really want to get into a deeper dive into the program, the NSGP. My colleague Rob Goldberg and I will do that over the next series of slides and save time for some Q&A at the end. I think right off the bat, it's important to note, you heard from Michael indicating this is really a year-long process, and we are in the midst of that pre-planning phase. The notice of funding opportunity will be released at the end of the month. So much of this guidance that we're providing today, it's important to keep in mind that it's preliminary in nature. We expect minor changes, not subsequent, but it is the reality that the government may make some changes to the application, the process, and it's important that we understand what those look like as they're coming out. If you do not already know your grants point of contact within your state administrative agency, and you'll hear us say SAA, State Administrative Agency, many times throughout this program, particularly for those of you that are not familiar with the program or just coming into today's with a little bit more learning about what the program actually entails. It's really important to understand the state level requirements, as there's sometimes some deadlines and different requirements locally versus what comes down with the federal guidance. And we'll cover that in further detail. Next slide, please. So overarchingly, you heard about this a little conceptually and historically, but what does the program really seek to do? As Michael and Rabbi Brothstein indicated, the program was launched in 2005, really with the sole purpose of protecting and providing added security and resources for security to nonprofits deemed at risk of terrorist attack. Really, as the landscape has changed both in the threat and risks, as we've seen over the last decade and a half, that eligibility and also the allowability for use of funds has also changed somewhat to the positive, expanding from initial physical security requirements, enhancements only to some of those training and also preparedness planning activities to include tabletop exercises and related training efforts that really kind of help with that goal of a holistic security program. Now, we'll talk a little bit about some of the allowable costs in a little while. Rob will cover some of that, and I will as well. But I think it's really important to note that while you're looking at your facility from the standpoint of protecting it, as we look at how, and many of you have heard this all hazards, all risk approach and whole community approach, it's really important to think through as well, how does your organization, how does your facility fit into the broader community response? Many of us involved in disaster response or relief, particularly faith-based organizations, really after Katrina in 2005, there was a better recognition of really integrating those nonprofits, those faith-based organizations and social service organizations into that broader collective community response. So as you look through the application, we'll talk a little bit further, it is really important to promote that emergency preparedness component and understand and be able to articulate how any impact to your facility, your organization has a broader impact on the community, and similarly, what role you play in a broader community response. Next slide, please. So this is a bit of a historical snapshot. I think it's just important to provide some context to the growth of the program since this collaborative approach took place nearly 16 years ago now. Since 2005, we've seen a steady increase year over year in total dollar amounts with some ups and downs in the middle years. But based on congressional funding and appropriations, as we now know, FY 2021, which we're coming up on that application process, the funding has doubled from up to 180 million from 90 million last year. And again, up significantly from the 60 million in FY 2019. This year, that breaks down to an even split between the Nonprofit Security UASI program and the Nonprofit Security State program, or S program. And you'll hear more about the distinctions between that for those organizations and facilities located outside the traditional or original DHS designated urban areas. So we'll speak about the difference in a little while. Last year was the highest total award in the amount of gross awards made across the history of the program, obviously until this year. It is a competitive process, and we did see last year, as you see in the chart, over 2,100 applications with awards made to over 1,100, representing an award rate which was somewhere north of 52%, which was a great number and a little bit higher than past years. We saw maybe a 30 or 40% award rate on applications. Next slide, please. So talking about eligibility for a moment, eligible organizations must be nonprofit agencies and organizations and determined to be at a high risk of terrorist attack. Those are the two fundamental components to be eligible for the program. Historically, as I previously mentioned, eligibility was related only to those DHS identified UASI regions. It was only really in the last two grant cycles that expanded to include areas outside the UASI regions, which essentially made everyone eligible across the country, so long as you had those two initial qualifiers that I mentioned as far as nonprofit organization, that would be able to articulate risk. We will know for certain if any changes have been made to the UASI regions following the release of the Notice of Funding Opportunity, the NOFO, you'll hear that word used time and time again, in late February. Regardless of where that qualification sits, that will not impact the eligibility of those nonprofits, but it may determine which program you will be applying to based upon geographic location, whether or not you sit inside or outside of the UASI region. For 2021, program dollars, again, are expected to be split evenly with 90 million for each of those programs. So it's going to be a really equitable split there. And Rob will talk more about the funding allocation process shortly. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, UASI regions, I just want to spend a minute on this to really give folks an understanding of what this means and what this looks like. It's important to note, I know the title's up there, but I want to flag this. This slide is merely informational for awareness purposes and represents the 2020 UASI regions, which is last year. As I mentioned, we could potentially see some changes this year. Typically, they are not significant. But for example, as we've seen in the past, we may have had 32 UASI regions. 1 year Las Vegas was included, then excluded, then added back in. Same thing with New Orleans. And really it is determined by a year over year risk assessment process that DHS and Fema look at holistically across the country based on geography, based on risk, and a formula that is known to them that determines those UASI regions. But as I mentioned, regardless, this is not going to impact anyone's eligibility now that the program has expanded beyond what used to be restricted UASI regions. But again, it will dictate whether or not you are applying to one of these regions or you are applying to the NSGP program. Next slide, please.
So the NSGP program is one of a complement of national grants that support the nation's collective responsibility to prepare and secure the country from foreign and domestic threats. The investments supported through NSGP are intended to help build a safe and resilient nation by achieving one or more of the following capabilities. As we discussed later in the impact section of the PowerPoint, a sub-applicant will be required to identify at least one of these capabilities that will be built or achieved through their project. This information will be assessed by FEMA to predict or measure the efficacy or likelihood of success of the project request. Failing to clearly identify the applicable capabilities will negatively impact a sub-applicant score. Next slide, please. This year, as previously mentioned, Congress appropriated $180 million for the Nsgp program, split evenly between the two prongs, the Nsgp urban area and the Nsgp state. In the notice of funding opportunity, FEMA will determine which urban areas will be eligible to participate in the urban area program. Only at the end of the award process, around mid-August to early September, will each participating urban area learn how much funding their jurisdiction has been awarded. Whereas by contrast, FEMA will publish the specific funding allocations that each state will receive to carry out the Nsgp state initiative at the beginning of the process in the notice of funding opportunity. FEMA has established a 3-year period of performance to complete Nsgp funded projects. Following general federal grant practices, the Nsgp awards are paid out through a reimbursement format as a precaution against misuse of funds. The subgrantees are required to lay out the funding for the approved project investments and activities and submit reimbursement requests that substantiate the outlays to the state administrative agency. Only permissible uses of the funds that were included in the application and approved in the award notice can be reimbursed. This year, we expect the notice of funding opportunity will be announced during sometime during the last week of February. Once this occurs, the state administrative agency will have about 45 to 60 days to receive, score, and submit sub-grant applications to FEMA. Within this timeframe, the SAAs will establish the grant period to receive sub-grant applications, which can vary by jurisdiction. But generally speaking, we expect nonprofits will have about 30 days plus or minus to complete and submit their applications to their state administrative agencies. FEMA will also set the funding caps in the notice of funding opportunity. The current cap is $100,000 for both the urban area and state initiatives. Although the SAAs, especially under the state program, may set a lower cap in their jurisdiction in order to increase the total number of applicants they may recommend for funding across the state. As FEMA received an increase in funding this year, they may very well increase the cap for one or both of the programs. By law, awards must be announced no later than midnight, September 30th, but they are typically made between mid-August and early September. Next slide, please. As previously mentioned, the program can support several categories of permissible costs, including physical target hardening, emergency preparedness planning, training and exercises, and the hiring of contracted security personnel. However, the lion's share of the grant supports physical target hardening, consistent with FEMA's position that the program's primary intent is to save lives and protect property. Target hardening under the program is limited to 2 categories of physical security equipment and inspection and screening systems set forth in FEMA's approved equipment list. Examples of approved equipment include gates, fences, and bollards, lighting systems, access control systems, video camera and surveillance systems, reinforced locks and windows and doors, and more. I do warn that navigating the online AEL portal can be a bit challenging and take some patience, so take time to walk through navigating the portal to become familiar and comfortable using it. When we review sections 3 and 4 of the investment justification, we will address in greater detail what target hardening entails, as well as the types of training, planning, and exercises that can be utilized under the grant. Next slide, please. All permissible costs to be considered for funding using the Nsgp must be included in the sub-applicant's investment justification. If it is not included in the IJ, equipment or activities normally permissible will be disqualified from funding. Additionally, pre-award costs are generally not allowed, such as security investments made prior to the award or costs associated with conducting the risk assessment or completing the investment justification. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Rob. We largely covered most of this, but I wanted to put it back up again just to make one final point related to the distinction between the NSGP Urban Area Security Initiative component and the NSGP S program, which Rob just articulated. Typically, it may be clear depending on where you reside, but I think it bears kind of reinforcing the point is that first step is really verifying that your nonprofit organization is located within or outside of a designated UASI area. So determining that, could be through your SAA if it's not clear when you actually look at the Urban Area Security Initiative list. The boundaries are typically a little bit, depending on, some of the areas around a UASI region called the Metropolitan Statistical Area. It may be a little unclear which UASI area or whether or not you actually sit in a region. So just any questions, as always, you'll hear us continuously say, it's best to steer those to your state administrative agency as they will be the ones to provide that clear guidance and confirmation locally. Rob?
So this evaluation criteria applies to both the urban area and state initiatives. The application is structured to assess how well a sub-applicant meets these requirements. Additionally, sub-applicants will be evaluated to make sure they've made the correct designation for applying to the correct program initiative, which is based on the sub-applicant's physical address, and whether they have previously received NSGP funding in prior years. We expect that Fema will continue to apply a certain level of bonus points, most recently 5 points, to the final score of organizations that have not previously received an NSGP grant award. Next slide, please. To be clear, the state is the applicant and the nonprofit is the sub-applicant. When FEMA releases its notice of funding opportunity for the NSGP program, they will be releasing it to the state's designated Homeland Security Emergency Management Agency, referred to in the NOFO as the State Administrative Agency or the SAA. The SAAs are responsible for applying for the grants on behalf of the nonprofit sub-applicants. The nonprofit sub-applicants will look to their SAAs for all official guidance, instructions, and application materials required of FEMA and the state, including the application form. They are the sub-applicant's point of contact. In nearly all circumstances, there would be absolutely no reason for a nonprofit to engage FEMA directly. That would be a red flag that the nonprofit is not following directions. It should be noted that the state administrative agencies may operate their NSGP program somewhat differently from state to state, as FEMA guidelines provide the SAAs with a degree of latitude and discretion in how they proceed. As such, the SAA's interpretation and application of the guidelines is what matters most to the sub-applicants in their jurisdictions. For example, while not in FEMA guidance, some states may require pre-qualification to do business within the state or require sub-applicants to register with the Federal Contracting System for Award Management. While not major hurdles to qualify, they must be satisfied and take time to complete. Under these circumstances, all sub-applicants should carefully review the instructions and requirements posted or provided by their SAA and rely utmost on the state guidance or any additional details or requirements provided by the SAA. And I note that some SAAs have already posted preliminary instructions and timelines for the upcoming application. So it's important for sub-applicants to check with their SAAs or their websites fairly regularly up until the FEMA NOFO announcement to make sure they're not missing anything from their own state administrative agencies. Next slide, please. The application is called an investment justification, or IJ. There are 7 parts to the investment justification, which we will review in order. Some but not all of the sections have character limitations, and most but not all of the sections will be scored. However, completeness is paramount, as even sections that are not scored specifically will still be evaluated, and the quality and completeness of all responses will impact the final score. So consequently, all sections should be treated with the same level of importance and care, and none should be taken for granted. Next slide, please. The applicant information section focuses on the sub-applicant's general demographics, such as its organization type, whether it's a house of worship, a school, a hospital, a community center, and so forth. Additionally, each nonprofit is required to submit a mission statement along with the IJ. Also, as mentioned, the physical address question will determine whether the sub-applicant applies under NSGP urban area or NSGP state, and a mistake here could lead to disqualification of an application. With respect to providing a 501c3 number or employer identification number, certain organizations such as churches, mosques, and synagogues are automatically exempt and are not required to provide recognition of exemption. They would leave the EIN number blank. However, some SAAs may require exempt organizations to submit an affidavit or other statement affirming tax exempt status. Next slide, please. There are two parts to the background section. In the first part, the sub-applicant should make the case that the type of organization it is and its role and place in the community make it likely a target of threat. This could be exemplified by its membership, its mission statement, services offered, population served, curriculum, programs or services offered, or its symbolic value in the community. In the second part, the sub-applicant must explain any role it has in responding to or recovering from a terrorist attack. Many sub-applicants struggle to answer this part because they do not normally see themselves in a first responder role. In this section, sub-applicants may want to explain their role in responding to man-made or natural disasters, such as providing relief from hurricanes, fires, or earthquakes, responding to devastating attacks such as 9/11 or the Oklahoma City bombing. In a crisis, does the organization open its doors and services to first responders, serving as a central meeting point for responders or providing them with the respite care they might need to successfully do their jobs? Similarly, does the organization provide impacted community members with food, shelter, or counseling, or other emergency supports or services in times of crisis? That's the type of information that a sub-applicant may want to input in this section of the investment justification. Next slide. NSGP is a risk-based program. In making decisions, the determination of risk is a central factor in how the SAAs and FEMA will rank and prioritize the applications they review. Therefore, each sub-applicant is required to conduct a vulnerability risk assessment, which serves as a framework for them to identify risks and weaknesses and determine and prioritize the resources they seek through the grant to address their most critical security needs. The risk section of the IJ is made up of three parts that address the specific or relative threats to the sub-applicant, identify the vulnerabilities or weaknesses in their physical security or the gaps in emergency preparedness planning or training they need, and describe the consequences or impact a terrorist threat would have on the sub-applicant, its staff, volunteers, constituents, and community. Next slide.
So to talk a little bit more about the vulnerability risk assessment that Rob spoke about as one of the requirements, it is a critical first step and it is a requirement of the application that's submitted to the state. The assessment really is the first component of establishing what your baseline is, identifying those vulnerabilities, the gaps, and informs the IJ, the investment justification. Organizations should work with qualified providers, security directors within your organizations or that you're aware of, law enforcement, other physical security professionals to complete that assessment. It should be noted as well that we have clarified some of the initial guidance that the majority of state administrative agencies, nearly most of them, will allow the use of a self-assessment document. But again, that is a point you want to clarify with your SAA if there's a question there. Recently, our partners at DHS CISA, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency, released the Houses of Worship self-assessment document, which is available through their website. I know that went out broadly to the faith-based community. Additionally, SCN team developed over the past couple of weeks a self-assessment tool that's been updated since our release last year. That's available through our website, which could also, assist organizations with doing a self-assessment tool or doing a self-assessment or having a security individual from your organization or tangential to your organization conduct that with you. One of the things I should note of this tool that we've done this year is Rob went through the authorized equipment list and talked about that a little bit. It is critically important as you are tying your risk assessment to your investment justification that you're also selecting authorized equipment to fill a vulnerability or close a gap. The tool that SCN provided and developed this year helps you do that through a drop-down menu of a series of authorized equipment tied to a specific area within a facility that you'll be assessing. So please, that is available through our website, which is listed on the bottom of the slide, if that's helpful to folks in this process. Next slide, please. So I want to cover target hardening in a couple different buckets. I think it's important to look at the totality of the opportunities in front of us, from target hardening in the physical security improvements, which the grant really started with, to planning, training, and exercises. As you've heard, and with the origin of the grant, the primary goal was target hardening, really identifying and installation of protective security equipment, protective measures that relate to your vulnerabilities discovered throughout that assessment process. Physical security equipment could be something as simple as a reinforced door, which we know in the Jewish community repelled an attacker at a synagogue in Halle, Germany, window film on vulnerable glass, CCTV cameras in facilities, advanced access control, or things as more complex as intrusion detection systems. Again, equipment must be, number one, address and mitigate and correct the vulnerability that's identified through your assessment process, and two, be on FEMA's authorized equipment list. As Rob mentioned, it's a little daunting, a massive Excel sheet when you first look at it, but if you really kind of look at the language amidst those cells, it really does start to make some sense. And again, the document that we provide on the website as it relates to the security assessment provides some further breakdowns of that. Again, the common theme that you'll hear: consult with your SIA on specific questions or clarifications if you're unsure whether something qualifies as an allowable cost. As Rob mentioned, we don't want to be in a position where you're being disqualified or not considered when we have an opportunity to make confirmations with those agencies. Next slide, please. So looking a little bit more at planning, we would encourage those of you that have a role in the security emergency planning within your facility to think about how you can leverage the grant for advancing some of those activities and efforts. Really, that goal of creating and establishing a holistic security program and posture. I think we take for granted and forget some of the things as faith-based and houses of worship organizations do to support the community during crisis, after disaster, or in advance of other types of activities. So really thinking through how we can further develop and enhance those capabilities, not just internally, but as part of the whole community, is a real opportunity here. So whether if that's developing, security operations plan, emergency operation plan, emergency action plan, or broader community-wide resiliency plans, there is opportunity to explore, funding for that within the purview of your program and the allowability of the grant as it relates to planning and preparedness. Next slide, please. Training is one of obviously the most critical components of a security program that you'll hear SCN talk about both through our webinars and our day-to-day operations. Training should definitely be a priority, and we encourage you to take full advantage of the ability to request funding for training. Some of the topics are here on the slide. Many of you may be familiar with Community Emergency Response Team, that type of training, that is free type of training, but other trainings that may have a cost or opportunity to attend certainly can be qualified and allowable under the program, whether it's safety and security training, whether it's stop the bleed training and related training tourniquets or kits that are made available that could also qualify as part of your IJ if the need is articulated to address a gap, vulnerability, or mitigate same. Next slide, please. Kind of going one step further from day-to-day training. In the past, I know many of you have probably been familiar with or participated in some of the FEMA and DHS regional faith-based tabletop exercises. These are great opportunities to also consider building these into a grant application. Many of you have done these locally with first responders and law enforcement. And not only is it a good opportunity to use qualified funds for training to advance your own organizational needs and your community needs, but it also really is a community-wide kind of joint effort and capacity building opportunity when organizations come together, through a funded exercise to test plans, to collaborate, to understand roles and responsibilities, mutual aid agreements, and how we might support one another across the whole community, both preparing for and responding to, a man-made or natural event. Next slide, please.
So the ability to contract security personnel or off-duty police is a relatively new permissible cost. The funding may not be used to underwrite existing security contracts and may not be used to purchase equipment for contracted security personnel. The guidance last year required that sub-applicants submit a plan that explains how contracted security personnel costs will be sustained after the funding or period of performance of the award expire, suggesting that in the absence of sustainment capabilities, this may not be considered by the SAA to be a good investment of limited resources. We do expect that contracted security personnel will be a continued eligible cost this year, and as required of all permissible costs under the NSGP, this investment will need to be identified as a priority within the vulnerability risk assessment and included as a requested investment within the IJ in order to be considered for funding. Next slide, please. The project milestone question goes to competency. The SAAs and FEMA want to have confidence in the sub-applicant's understanding of the scope and nature of their project and that the project can be completed within the 36-month period of performance. Milestones may include the hiring of vendors, ordering, acquiring, and installing equipment, planning, schedule, and carrying out of training, as well as the submission of FEMA's required administrative paperwork and so forth. This section should set forth realistic estimated details and timelines for the start and completion of each major action step of the project. Next slide. The project management section also serves as a confidence builder in the review process. It shows that the sub-applicant has a management plan worked out, has assigned responsibilities to competent people, has thought through the process, and identified any potential challenges it might have to address or resolve during project implementation. This section also importantly provides an opportunity for the sub-applicant to highlight how the grant opportunity will promote coordination and collaboration with state and/or local law enforcement or other public partners such as first responders and hospitals. It is highly recommended that the sub-applicants figure out a way to integrate law enforcement and first responders into the framework of project planning and management, as well as possible activities or opportunities to build lasting relationships with them. Next slide, please. In the impact section, the sub-applicant is required to address two questions. First, they are asked to explain the expected measurable outputs and outcomes resulting from the completion of the project that would best illustrate the success of the project. Here, the response should include a self-assessment statement on how in practice the target hardening investments requested through the grant most efficiently and effectively reduce the risks and vulnerabilities identified in the grant and thus protect against the consequences of a potential terrorist attack. Second, the sub-applicant is asked to describe the security and resiliency improvements that will be achieved through the grant. This section will help FEMA assess the contributions the sub-applicant will make to the nation's collective national preparedness goals through the proposed project. To do this, sub-applicants are required to describe how specific project investments build or achieve one or more of FEMA's designated core capabilities, which fall under 5 mission areas: prevention, protection, mitigation, response, and recovery. Under the Nsgp program, the mission areas of prevention and protection are the most common mission areas addressed through the Nsgp investments. Next slide. The grant is highly competitive. Therefore, a sub-applicant should never leave an open question. Partial answers are better than no answers at all. Additionally, sub-applicants must be especially careful to answer the questions in the sections where they are asked. The right answer placed in the wrong section will earn 0 points. Also, while there's a maximum raw score of 40 points that can be earned, the final score will be multiplied by a factor between 1 and 3 based on the sub-applicant's organizational type, and sub-applicants that have not previously received a grant will receive additional bonus points as determined by the upcoming NOFO. And as mentioned, last year, there were 5 additional bonus points added for first-time grantees. Next slide.
So I want to just cover on this last slide before we turn to some questions. As you heard at the outset, obviously this is a year-round process for those of you that this is new to or just beginning. Certainly not too late, but there are some key things that should be thought about now and ensuring that this is not a comprehensive and exhaustive list, but some things to think about in the days and weeks ahead prior to the notice of funding opportunity being released towards the end of the month, as Rob and Michael had indicated. Really thinking through ahead of time, assembling those key stakeholders that need to be part of this, whether it's finance, whether this is facilities, whether it's people that need to make decisions on funding. Some of the questions that come up in the chat is this, and Rob will talk about this further. This is a reimbursement grant. So there is certain outlays of funds depending on when work is done, when different components of the process come into play. So there is some pre-work and pre-planning that needs to be done, in advance to do that. As I mentioned, contacting the SAA for specific grant information requirements. The deadline set by the state change at their discretion to give them enough time as the actual, grantees to be able to, have time to review the grants and submit them to FEMA. So be sure that when the NOFO comes out, don't just follow that deadline, that guidance from FEMA. Ensure that the SAA guidance and any local and state level requirements are met, in advance. Some of those things are not difficult, but depending on the systems and bureaucracy, could take a little time to get registrations updated or done accordingly, whether it's registering for, state contracting authority and approval, or any other requirements that may need to be done that are either outdated, simple things as ensuring that your nonprofit is in good standing with your state in order to, address any issues that might be required to apply. As I mentioned on a few slides ago, conducting that facility risk and vulnerability assessment, that is a requirement. It is a busy time of year for those that do this type of work and request to do it. So ensure that that is done as quickly as possible if that's not already been done. There is not firm guidance on, I know one of the questions came up in the Q&A was, can we use an assessment from a couple years ago? There is not firm guidance on how old an assessment can be. We typically say, a couple of years is generally okay. You should ensure that no major changes have been made. And if you were a past grant recipient, if updates were made to your facility, that an assessment or an updated component to the assessment is done to ensure that it is accurate. And if something was funded last year or something that wasn't funded last year, that makes it into your identified vulnerability or gap for this year, and you can address that, in this year. Reviewing the 2020 investment justification from Familiarity. As Rob articulated before, this is the bulk of the application. Typically, there are not significant changes year over year. So getting a head start and just familiarizing yourself with those sections that Rob ran through to get a sense of some of the narratives that we're going to need to write about the role our agency plays in responding to an event, just some of the risk information on the front end. Some of that is data that, going to the next bullet, you can compile and research now and have that ready to go prior to completing or reviewing the 2021 guidance when it comes out towards the end of the month. Again, reviewing that AEL list and familiarizing yourself with security equipment options, particularly if you've completed your vulnerability assessment, start to understand what options are on the authorized equipment list that mitigate and fill those gaps, in your assessment. Starting to identify either vendors or security solutions providers in your area that can either provide some of those initial quotes, estimates, once you've identified, the opportunities that you're going to be looking to address, and ensuring that you have a good sense of pricing when it comes to coming up with that bottom line request number based on your assessment, based on your IJ, and what you're scoping out in your application. Next slide, please. So lastly, this is just contact information for both of us. We will be providing, as Dina mentioned at the outset, a full recording of today's webinar out to all participants. And we will work through questions in the chat. I know many have been answered throughout, but we will go to a moderated Q&A that Dina will moderate across the team for additional questions, in the chat. Dina?
Great. Thank you, Pat and Rob. So As Pat mentioned, we've gotten several questions in throughout the course of the conversation. With the remaining time we have today, we'll try to get through as many as possible. And again, we will create that Q&A document that I referenced at the outset that will be available to everyone. So we'll work to address all of these questions in due time. To start, we'll do sort of a lightning round with eligibility and general how-to application questions. So first question, if you are not a house of worship, are you eligible for this?
The quick answer is any 501c3 organization is eligible to apply.
Thank you. And if you are a national organization, we spoke a lot about local, but at the national level, how does that work?
National organizations can apply for themselves as well. They would apply within the state or jurisdiction where they're resided.
Great.
If I could just add to that, because I did read some of those questions too. It's important to note, as a national organization, you can apply for your space, your facility. You can help provide guidance to, if you have constituent agencies, but this is not a blanket, grant application where you're applying on behalf of other local organizations. I just want to, Rob made that clear. I know there was a question about that specifically.
Yes, thank you, Pat. And one other question I think you saw as well related to organizations that share space, that there's more than one organization within the confines of a given entity. And perhaps we can address this at the same time, whether it's owned or leased. What is the recommendation on applying in those circumstances?
So you can either own or lease and still be eligible to apply. If you are applying just for your footprint, say as a tenant, you can do that. If you're an owner of the building and want to apply for the exterior and say common spaces, you can do that as well. And you can also, because it is one location, apply for one grant and the investments can be installed throughout the building as well. So because it's a competitive grant, you never know until you know if you're successful or not. So it could be that multiple applicants from the same address apply and some don't succeed in any given year. You just have to apply again if they so choose in future cycles.
Great. And along those lines on the process and just general application basics, can you repeat information related to the SAAs, how you would identify who you should be looking for and how you might reach them?
Sure. So in the post-webinar document that we're going to create, which we call an FAQ, we will include a point of contact link so that folks can identify who their appropriate state administrative agency is, and also access to their website. So someone who's interested can try to call them, and they can also go on their website and try to locate the specific area that will address the nonprofit security grant program.
I'll just add to that, Dean. I know FEMA actually does this pretty well. If you actually go to FEMA.gov and search for SAA, they have a state-by-state listing, not just the actual agency that is your SAA, but typically will have an initial point of contact, either email, phone number. So that's a good place to start as well. In addition to when Rob and our document comes out.
Right. That link should get you to that same site on FEMA.
Excellent. It's a common question, especially these days. Glad everyone's thinking about cybersecurity and that allowability. Can we address that?
Yeah, so generally speaking, cybersecurity, there is some permissible equipment associated as well as training. I believe the notice of funding opportunity that will come out at the end of the month will address it as well. Again, we have asked FEMA to be clearer about how they view cybersecurity investments in terms of priorities. In the past, they haven't viewed it at the same level as physical security enhancement, but we'll know in just less than a few weeks, I imagine, more specifically about what that is. But there certainly is allowable equipment, particularly in the area of backing up systems.
Great. There have been a few questions related to, and I know we addressed broadly that this is a reimbursement-based grant process. So some questions around, how smaller organizations might navigate that, how those on the line here and those interested in applying can think about being able to undertake this grant process with that in mind.
Sure. Couple of things. One, we've talked about the cap currently at 100,000. But I've seen many applications for seeking investments at much less denominations, as low as 3,000 or 4,000. So sometimes that has to be considered as part of the factor. The other thing is, in terms of ability to laying out funds, the other thing is that the reimbursement process, again, you can submit reimbursement as parts of the project are being completed, so that you can be seeking reimbursement for that. When you get the reimbursement, could then subsequently underwrite, next stages in the acquisition and installation process. It is a bit of a challenge for some. I recognize that, but this program follows basic federal government, grant reimbursement guidelines.
Wonderful. A few questions related to that. So in order to estimate those costs, how would an organization go about getting that information to be able to include that in their application and know how much to be asking for?
So everything begins with the risk assessment, which will identify weaknesses and will therefore lead to recommendations, and I assume in priority in terms of what is most needed first. And then we generally recommend, like when seeking, engaging any vendors, to get 3 or so estimates for whatever it is that the investments seek to acquire and install. So if you're looking for to acquire video surveillance equipment based on your risk assessment, then you would want to get 3 or so estimates from various vendors to make sure that what you're getting back in terms of putting together a budget is based on your own knowledge base, and to make sure that you're getting, that you could make sure that you're getting accurate estimates.
Great. One last question.
There.
Thank you. I'll kick this to Pat. The last question we've received in here. Can we recommend how an organization might go about receiving an assessment, who they might look to get that?
Sure, good question. And I just want to add one point to Rob's last point. I think for many of you that are new to this process or have not gone through, and a lot of folks, rightly are not technology experts or security experts that are managing the process internally, I think it's important to get an objective assessment done. And I'll talk about that in a second. A lot of times, if we are going to a vendor, and this is limited number, so this is not a blanket statement, oftentimes, or there have been times where a vendor will want to do an assessment to pitch a particular type of equipment or brand of equipment. So I think it's really important to understand objectively and be part of that assessment process to understand your true vulnerabilities and what needs are required to fill some of those gaps. So really, first and foremost, locally, local law enforcement, police departments are a great place to start. Not every department will do the type of assessment, either from liability or other issues, but sometimes it's bandwidth. DHS protective security advisors around the country are able and willing to support faith-based organizations in doing assessments. Again, once we're into grant season, that ability and scale gets a little difficult with the number of requirements and things that they need to do. Professional assessors, professional security folks, and then as I had mentioned previously, self-assessment tools are accepted. Rob, I'll turn to you one sec. Self-assessment tools are accepted, and we encourage you either through DHS or through SCN, take advantage of those tools as well. Rob, do you want to comment?
Just a general comment, if we're finished with the immediate Q&A, which is that it may sound daunting for a lot of people who are hearing this for the first time. And the audience may be thinking about the grant that's going to commence at the end of the month. But for those of you, I just want to point out that if the timing is not right for you because of the brief timeline that's allotted, that what we're providing today is also a roadmap for things you can be doing over the course of this entire year, so that when the next phase comes around a year from now, you won't feel that sort of strain or stress of time or not knowing. This is the 16th year of this program. We fully expect that there's going to be a 17th year this time next year. So for those of you that need our help because you want to tackle this immediately, we're available. And I would also just say for those of you who are going to take the long road to get there next year, we're also available to help you along that path as well.
Excellent. Great way to close this out. Thank you, Rob, Pat. Thank you to everyone, all of our experts and speakers today. And of course, thank you to everyone who joined us. We will distribute the recording and all relevant resources as discussed to all of the attendees here today, and make sure those are available on the SDN website as well. Please stay in touch. Don't hesitate to reach out if you require assistance or would like more information. We're here to assist, and certainly appreciate everyone's partnership in pursuit of a safer and more secure faith-based community and community at large. So thank you again for joining, and have a great day.